Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, July 28th, 2016. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week we sampled two beers straight from the taps of the Mad Fermentationist, Mike Tonsmeire. A stout that had been reinvigorated with a specialty grain tea and a New England IPA. We'll get details from Mike on how he brewed both beers. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And if you buy any of our DVD combos, you get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener. And don't forget to get a copy of our Brewer's Logbook. You can use it to log and track up to 50 batches of beer. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. We also have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon shopping, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we greatly appreciate your support there. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own Magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site as well. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app at Amazon.com. We have a Windows Phone app. We're on the BlackBerry Podcast Directory, and we're on the Stitcher app as well, and we're on Google Play Music, too. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our virtual guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support, and thanks to everybody who's done so already. On Monday, I posted the Basic Brewing video episode featuring the kettle-soured 100% rye hoppy beer that I made with the help of my high-gravity electric brew-in-a-bag system. That beer is only 1.6% ABV, but it is very satisfying and refreshing. It wasn't as aggressively tart as I expected, but maybe that's a good thing. It doesn't strip the enamel off of your teeth, but there is enough tartness to accentuate the citrus, tangerine character that came from the Simcoe hops that I used. I've been getting some really good advice on YouTube, on the YouTube post of that show in the comment section there, on probiotics and commercial lactose strains and such as that would give a more sour character in a short period of time. So be sure to check that out. That's ongoing. I do want to revisit that brew, so stay tuned for that. And I appreciate everybody's advice that you're giving me on the YouTube comments and such. And I also have been getting some emails as well. I got some email questions on that episode. Chris Camburis of Bascule Brewing Company in Lorain, Ohio, writes, I was listening for an explanation as to why you didn't boil this beer, but I don't think you gave us a reason. Rye, you no boil. I didn't boil, but I did pasteurize twice. The first time after the mash, before I pitched the commercial lacto, and I did that because I wanted to kill any bugs that were in the grain itself, and I just wanted to see what the commercial lacto strain would do. And another time after the kettle souring rest, after it sat for 120 degrees for 5 days, I brought it up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 C for 15 minutes. And the second time that I pasteurized, I added the 3 ounces of the Simcoe hops at that point. I didn't want to extract a lot of bitterness from the hops, just flavor and aroma, so I didn't boil them. And as I understand it, 180 is just like maybe on the borderline when you start, isomerizing those alpha acids. So I wanted a hop flavor and aroma and not necessarily a lot of bitterness. One side effect from not boiling was that the beer is very cloudy. And I think that that's because I didn't get a protein break without boiling the beer. The yeast seemed to flocculate out, and I did gelatin, fine it with gelatin as I was going into the keg. So I don't think that that's yeast. I think that that's like a protein haze. But I'm okay with that. I kind of think it's cool looking. It is definitely an odd but tasty brew. on that episode, I said I was having trouble coming up with rye-based names for my beers. Well, Mike from Twin Falls, Idaho, has some suggestions. Mike says, "It's my beer, and I can rye if I want to." Number 2, "Here's suds in your rye." I think that's my favorite. And "Say rye to two-row." And one more, "Ryeing Steve's patience." Well, there you go. I appreciate that, Mike. Here's suds in your rye. It's pretty darn good. Those are awesome. And at one point, Steve said that I was becoming a rye savant. And I missed my opportunity to say that I'm turning into Rhine Man. I amuse myself. We have definitely wandered into the dad joke category. Or maybe we're just still in the dad joke category. I want to take a minute to talk about our sponsors, Desiree and Dave of High Gravity in Tulsa. If you watch the latest Basic Brewing video episode, you can see my high-gravity electric brew-in-a-bag system in operation. Mine is the 240-volt, 10-gallon system with the pump, although I didn't use the pump in this brew. So there is flexibility there now that I have the temperature probe in the side of the kettle instead of the lid, or in addition to, I still have the old one. Steve has the 120-volt, 5-gallon system with the pump. And High Gravity also offers a 120-volt, 5-gallon system with no pump in the true tradition of brew in a bag. So I was fine with not using the pump on this 5-gallon low-gravity beer with my system. But on high-gravity beers or 10-gallon batches, I'm still going to use the pump to increase the circulation and make sure that I can get as much extraction as possible. You can see all the options for electric brewing systems, or just pick up a high-gravity controller if you have the rest of the hardware at highdgravitybrew.com. And for ingredients and many other products, High Gravity offers $7.99 flat rate shipping. highdgravitybrew.com. Okay, on this trip to the Baltimore, D.C. area for HomebrewCon, one of my goals was to visit Mike Tonsmeire's house and sample from his kegerator. And on our epic day of touring around with the Mad Fermentationist, we did just that. And since Mike wrote the book American Sour Beers, you'd think we'd mainly be talking about sours. But it was a delicious stout and a tasty New England IPA that got us talking. Mike Tonsmeire, after 10 years, we're finally at your house.
Sitting at my dining room table. It's a pleasure to talk to you every time, but particularly this time live from my home.
And we have Steve Wilkes.
It's odd not to be speaking to you over Skype.
Yeah, 3D is more fun. Yeah. Andy Sparks.
It's great to be here.
Bob Stemsky.
I'm allergic to cats.
How could you be allergic to ale and love beer so much?
They have two little kitty cats. We're not to the Chris Colby factor of cat ownership here, but first of all, let's talk about the two beers that we've been sampling off of your kegs. Mm-hmm. First off, the incredibly roasty, incredibly milkshakey stout.
Sure, that was a fun one. I've had a little bent for a while trying to do weird creative things with Reinheitsgebot ingredients. So the idea being that people are always trying to be creative by adding weird ingredients, and I've certainly done that too. Interesting fruits or spices or flowers or those sorts of things. And I think there's still so much fertile ground for weird experimental things with those classic beer ingredients. So the idea for this one was that I brewed a porter. Is actually the other half of a chocolate butternut squash spiced fall kind of recipe. I only wanted to have one dark beer on at a time, so I took the other 5 gallons. No butternut squash, no cocoa powder, no treacle, no cinnamon, no nutmeg, no vanilla bean. And I put into a keg, and I put into my fridge downstairs and just left it until I was sick of that butternut squash beer after 4.5 months, and I dumped the last half gallon because it was January and I didn't want any more butternut squash beer. And I took this one out. And I've been thinking about this idea for a while to sort of re-roast a beer. In the same way that you might have an imperial stout or a barley wine and age it for 6 months or a year and then dry hop it to give that last burst of freshness. I thought, why not do the same thing with roasted malt? So I took some dark roasted grains, and I actually did some experiments where I crushed up Carafa and Carafa Special and roasted barley and black patent, and I steeped them in a little cold water overnight, filtered them out through a coffee filter to get that sort of concentrated, just dark malt flavor, and tasted all of them. And I eventually ended up on a combination. I think it was Carafa and chocolate rye. I check my blog, themadfermentationist.com, for the specifics on all that. But the idea was that I made this tea. I then sort of made more of it and filtered it through and brought it up to temperature to pasteurize it and cooled it down, and then just dosed it directly into the keg. No fermentation, so you're not going to have all those delicate aromas being blown off by the CO2 produced by the yeast. It's on the cold side, and so just in the way you might add coffee beans late or that you might add dry hops, it sort of gets that flavor in there. I think it really worked out well. I'm serving it on a nitro tap at the moment, which is sort of I've always tried to keep something dark on there, so it's been a fun way to go about it. And I'm not sure that the beer tastes especially like fresher dark roast than any other dark beer I've ever done, but certainly a nice way that if you, say, want to split a batch or you want to, maybe a beer ended up not quite as roasty as you want, maybe you drank through half the keg and it's, it was okay, but hey, you want to try something different. Give it a try. See how those different dark malts influence the flavor. And honestly, because you're not fermenting out some of those sugars in there, they don't really add sweetness, but yeah, they add body and richness, and that's only like a 5.5% beer. It's really not a big beer, and that's something I'm all about is, trying to make beers that drink bigger than they are. I don't want them to be hot or boozy, but I want you to be satisfied with 1 or 2 glasses of a 5.5% beer rather than a 12% beer that is so mild and thinned out with simple sugars and that you're almost fighting against the alcohol. Why not take that little beer and build in body and richness and flavor and really pack it in a tight little package?
So could you really, we don't have the benefit of having tasted the beer before it was cold steeped, or the cold steeping was added. So what kind of flavor impacts did it bring to the beer?
Honestly, the beer after 5 or 6 months, 5.5% beer, even if it's well made, is starting to taste a little bit over the hill. The dark fruit was starting to come out. It was never a hugely roasty beer because it was designed to be the base beer for other flavors. It was a backdrop for spices and to let the squash come through and all that. It was just a little mellow, bland. Probably more in the dark brown ale to light porter kind of range. And now it's much more an American, sort of classic American stout. It really did add that brighter, fresher, roastier, chocolate coffee kind of tones, but also sort of a graininess I get from it that I think is at least partly from the fact that those grains weren't boiled for 60 minutes and went through fermentation. There may be a little bit of a different character that I can get, or maybe I'm just talking myself into it.
Well, it's delicious, whatever. So just to clarify, you cold steeped or room temperature steeped?
Room temperature steeped, yep.
And then filtered, brought it up to 180 degrees.
Yep.
Did you hold it there for
not long? Honestly, you can pasteurize in just a few seconds at 180 degrees. So it's not something you have to hold for very long.
And then brought it back down.
Yeah.
I just added it right to the keg.
And with something like that, you don't have to be too concerned. If you get down to 80 or 90, a pint or two of liquid isn't going to raise the temperature of 5 gallons of 30-something degree beer. Be careful, though, if it's already carbonated, you can run into issues with foaming if the temperature comes up quickly.
And did we talk about amounts of grain and the amount of the extract?
Off the top of my head, it was about half a pound of each of them. It was about 1 pound. So it wasn't a huge amount of grain, and there was already some dark grain in there. But with anything like this, I'll get emails asking very specific amounts on this or that. I would very much suggest take samples, make some tests, try the dark grains that you like brewing with, try them in different combinations, try them with the actual beer, and see how much works for your palate, because honestly, depending on how you grind it and how long you steep and the ratio of water to dark grains, your potency will be stronger or weaker than mine. And I think you're a lot better off, rather than trying to mimic exactly what I did as if it was a recipe, take it just as a concept, as a thought, something that you can work your way through, and see what works for your taste buds, see what works for your palate and for your grains and for your system, and don't worry too much about whether it's right or wrong. It's what's right for your beer, what's right for your palate.
Well, again, it was delicious.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just like a chocolate milkshake, and boy, I don't have a whole lot to add than what you just said.
I haven't tried it. I'm going to try it next.
Yeah, Andy went for the hoppy beer.
Oh, it's very good. It was chocolate milk for sure.
Yeah.
And the other beer that we've sampled is the one that you said you had a hoppy beer on tap, and Andy went straight for that one. So what do we have there?
So it's a New England IPA, and this is sort of an emerging style. Whether it was the Alchemist or Hill Farmstead or someone sort of started this idea of having. When I started homebrewing, people talked about East Coast IPAs with a bit of derision, that they were kind of English and they were just way too malty, and the hops weren't as bright and fresh. And West Coast IPA was where it was at. And the classic West Coast IPA is that you ferment the beer out generally with a relatively clean yeast, sometimes an English yeast, but usually 1056 American Ale, Chico. And then you try to remove as much of the yeast as you can. You get to be a clean, bright beer, and then you dry hop it. The idea there is you're just using the beer, the water, the alcohol as a solvent. You're pulling out hop compounds as they are. And really the goal of those beers is to have something that has a bunch of bitterness and then a whole bunch of hop character, and ideally hop character that you would be indistinguishable from sticking your nose into a hop bag. And that's great. Those beers are delicious. At certain points, I think there's a little bit of a race for IBUs, and the quality and character of the hop aroma was maybe put second fiddle to how many IBUs. Is it 300 IBUs, 400 IBUs? And this New England IPA I see as a little bit of a reaction to that. Trillium Brewing does them fantastic. Treehouse Brewing, Tired Hands in Philly does some great versions. There's a new brewery called Aslan in Northern Virginia that does them, and they're starting to spring up all over the country, but really it was a bunch of those places in New England that started. And generally the idea is that you go lower on the bitterness. This one was only 35 IBUs from a 60-minute boil edition, but then you really focus on those late boil editions. Some people are just going to hop burst it, do additions at 15, 5, 10. But for me, I like the bittering edition, and then I added, for a 10-gallon batch, 9 ounces of Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe at the end of the boil. I do the hop stand thing. The Ray Daniels, I think, was the one who sort of first popularized that. But it's really what happens at a real brewery. You add hops and they end up sitting in the hot wort for a while. You're not chilling it as fast as you can. You're giving some time to, there is some isomerization going. You're getting some bitterness, but you're also extracting flavorful oils. And part of the key there is that you're getting those oils in early, and you're going to have some interactions between the hops. You're going to have between the hops and the yeast. You can get some biotransformation. Particularly Citra is known for having geraniol, which is a rose floral sort of aromatic, but yeast strains will turn it into citronellol, which is a citrusy, people say lime or lemon or orange, something like that. And then, if that weren't enough, you can take more hops, and as fermentation is still going on, but it is sort of peaked and you're starting to see the crowds fall. Maybe you're at 80% attenuation of what you're expecting. So if you're expecting 80% attenuation, mid-60s attenuation, more hops. And again, the idea there is you've got yeast activity, and particularly as a home brewer, and particularly as a new home brewer who maybe doesn't have a CO2 system, if you add hops at that point and you introduce a little bit of oxygen, the yeast will scavenge that oxygen. It will take it up. You won't have to deal with oxidation. And oxygen really is the big bad wolf when it comes to hoppy beers. And honestly, until I started kegging, I really didn't brew great hoppy beers because you rack into secondary into a non-flush carboy with a bunch of hops. It's sitting there for a few weeks, then it's going into bottles, and it's sitting warm for a couple of weeks. And honestly, now it's 6 weeks since you brewed the thing, and the best time to drink a hoppy beer, I brewed that beer two weeks ago, two and a little bit. I mean, it's sat in the fermenter for maybe 10 days, and now it's been in the keg for about a week. So it's Wednesday today. I brewed it the Sunday before last. So the two yeast strains I used were the three big popular yeast strains for this style are Conan, which is the Alchemist yeast strain. It was originally English. It was originally Greg Noonan's from the Vermont pub where he was the brewer for years. He was the author of New Brewing Lager Beers and passed away tragically a few years ago. But really, the Alchemist was the one that sort of figured out that this strain with hops produces these amazing, juicy peach aromatics. It's almost too good at, though. It almost, at a certain point, doesn't matter what American hops you throw at it. Conan turns it into the Conan juicy, peachy flavor, which is terrific, but is, maybe after you brew with it a few times and you sort of dial everything in, it's great, but it's maybe not as exciting because you're not going to get that variation if you use Citra versus Mosaic versus Simcoe. And they're, not to say they're identical, but the yeast is a predominant flavor. And the one I prefer is Y Yeast 1318, which is the Boddington strain, which you wouldn't expect to be a great strain for, weird hoppy beers, but it does a little of that. It makes the hops a lot juicier, fruitier, fresher, takes away some of the greener, more vegetal flavors that you might get in some of those West Coast IPAs. And so I blended those two strains about 50-50. This is my first time trying that, trying to get some of that peachy fruitiness, but without it completely dominating. I think it worked pretty well. Next time I might go a little bit more in favor of the 1318. The strain I used for the Conan was Giga yeast, which I'd never used before there on the West Coast, Vermont IPA. But Conan is also available from a variety of other yeast manufacturers, East Coast Yeast, the Yeast Bay, Omega Labs, and a couple other sort of smaller, more regional ones have, normally, I think even White Labs now has a version of it. And normally it's some combination of Burlington, Vermont, Northeast, IPA, New England. Look for those sorts of terms, and that tends to be Conan or a Conan derivative. And it tends to be a little bit of a finicky strain. The Alchemist, because they've worked with so long, they know at different generations it behaves in different ways, and so it might be a strain that takes a little bit more practice to get used to. The other big one that Trillium has recommended using is 007 Dry English Ale, which is ironically the same one Stone suggests using, and Stone's beers and Trillium's beers both do fantastic hoppy beers. Couldn't be more different. It really comes down to hop timing, how you're using that, when you're dry hopping, those sorts of things. The resulting beer tends to be, you want it to be hazy. Some of the ones that sort of the people who don't like them might call them, milkshakes or, muddy and there is a line there where, and there's a lot of debate. My friend Scott Janis, who has a fantastic blog where he dives into these sorts of things, has talked about this, and he loves diving into the scientific studies. They tend to favor for water treatment chloride over sulfate. Sort of the old West Coast thing is Burtonization, get yourself 200, 300, 400 parts per million sulfate, get that dry, crisp, minerally character. But these beers, sort of the goal and the way I love Sean Hill from Hill Farmstead. He's always been nice to me. He'll never really tell you anything. And so at one point I posted about an IPA, and he wrote on my Facebook wall and said, "Oh, you're just adding sulfate. Why no chloride?" I wrote back like, it's like, what should I be looking for? If you try it, then you'll know. But really, his and he's a great quote from him. What keeps him up at night is mouthfeel. That's that he'll have to dump a beer and thinking about mouthfeel, and chloride is associated with a fuller palate. And so people often, when they talk about these beers positively, they say it has a pillowy mouthfeel. So it's not dry and crisp. It has an airiness, a lightness, a fullness to it. It's not sweet. It's not. They have generally very low crystal malts, so it's not sticky. It's not heavily malty, but they have a fullness of the palate that a lot of those West Coast beers that really just sort of glide over and hit you with the bitterness at the end. And so I aim for about 125 parts per million of both sulfate and chloride. Sometimes I'm a little more to one side. Sometimes I'm a little less. Honestly, I don't get too hung up in that because the malt itself is adding quite a bit of sulfate and chloride. And so you really don't have to, it's 5 parts per million here, 10 parts per million there. It's not going to make a huge difference. But, the difference between 50 and 150, that's the big difference. In the same way, I'm not as interested in the ratio. People often say, "Oh, is it 1-to-1 or is it 2-to-1?" Well, it doesn't really matter if it. I mean, what matters is it 10-to-5 or 500 to 1,000? I mean, those are very different things, and there's the same ratio. That, you know, saying something is 4-to-1 if it's 80-to-20 is very different than 400-to-100, even though the ratio is the same. And so I'm more worried about the general range that they're both in, about even and in the low to mid hundreds. The fun thing about both of those is you can actually dose them into the finished beer. The sulfate and the chloride, they aren't involved in the process in the way that carbonate and calcium and magnesium are. So you can dose them in and then taste the beer. Don't do any mineral additions. Start with real distilled ware. I cut my ware with distilled because I have a lot of carbonate here. Start with a real low mineral count, and hey, dissolve a little in some water, dose it into a couple of samples, taste them for yourself, see how it affects your palate, your beer, all that great stuff.
Yeah, we've done some experimenting with adding, say, gypsum at the, at bottling time even, and it makes an impact. You say it's cloudy, it's hazy,
yeah,
but it's not, I wouldn't say cloudy. It's hazy in the same way that you'd say like some wheat beers or something like that.
Yeah,
like a wit beer or something.
But for a lot of people, that's not what they expect out of a quote unquote well-made IPA. And it's particularly weird. Why it's cloudy is a big sort of topic for debate. Because honestly, a lot of these strains, like Petroleum Muse's 007, which is one of those strains that generally drops like a rock. I mean, it drops and gets chunky. And high chloride, as apparently Scott found out, was associated with poor flocculation. So that might be part of it. Maybe it's the hop compounds that are in there, and since they're sort of being churned up with the yeast, maybe they're coating the yeast, maybe they're inhibiting flocculation that way. A lot of these beers have a little bit of flake grain in them, but honestly not a lot. Mine was maybe 10 or 15% flaked wheat. I mean, it's something, but there are plenty of these beers that are hazy that don't have a lot of flake grain in them. So it's, they shouldn't be a yeasty beer. It shouldn't taste like a Hefeweizen. You might have a little yeast character, but it shouldn't be that raw eating yeast. I've certainly had some of these IPAs at some of these breweries that were too young. And in general, I'm a big fan of drinking an IPA as fresh as it can be. But honestly, some of these benefit from an extra couple of weeks in the bottle, and then you'll see down the bottom there's a quarter inch or a half inch of sediment that you can decant off. That maybe a lot of them are small, maybe they're pushing beers too fast, maybe who knows what it is. But it's something as a home brewer that's fun to taste the beer as the yeast settles out, and you can.
Or could it be another? Sort of a Hefeweizen kind of a theory where you need to rouse the yeast for this style. I mean, if it's supposed to be cloudy, and if a lot of bitterness settles out with yeast in the bottom of a bottle, maybe you want to, if you're bottle conditioning, maybe you want to rouse up these beers and pour them cloudy.
It's certainly something you could consider. A lot of these beers, honestly, they won't. It's not like after 2 or 3 weeks that they'll drop to crystal clear. They'll drop to what mine looks like. And sometimes when you have them earlier, they will pour almost opaque. And I've brewed some like that. Boy, there's a fine line there between, as you said, hazy and cloudy to murky and muddy, and then you start to almost feel the texture of the yeast on your tongue. It's gritty, and that's not what I want. And so it might be something that if you pour it, you swirl up and dose a little in. Again, depending on the brewery, depending on your palate and your taste preferences.
So we'll go to the hoppy beer expert, Andy Sparks. What you just finished your sample. What do you think?
Well, I finished it a little while ago, and it was quite delicious. It's actually really one of my favorite beer styles. That with low bitterness, aggressive bitterness, really refreshing and fruity. The aromatics really pop. You just have to get the glass kind of in your hand, and you can smell the fruitiness. I really enjoyed that beer a lot.
Steve, did you get a taste yet?
Yeah, I did, and I agree. It was just delightful to. I really enjoyed it. It was just juicy but again, it's like I get really tired of that West Coast thing. I appreciate and love those beers, but I just find this to be really refreshing and easy to get around. So.
Bob, have you had the hoppy beer yet?
Yes, I did. I had 1.5. Right? Well, I agree with everybody else. It doesn't hit you like an aggressive hoppiness. It's happiness. It's lighter, and it was very refreshing and fruity. I really loved it. I really did. Yeah.
Is this something you've played with yourself?
Yes, I have. Well, I played with a lot of it. I don't remember much of it. I tried a little bit too much, but I love hoppy beers, and I like working with any kind of hoppiness, whether I'm hopping a cider now and I'm hopping sort of a wine thing I'm doing. I'm kind of an experimentalist myself, but I like the light hoppiness. I'm getting away from the aggressive stuff.
Well, this idea that hoppy means bitter. Hoppy doesn't necessarily mean that. It can mean that, but that's such a one-dimensional way of thinking of hops, and I guess it's because we kind of like things to be black and white, and so hoppy means that's really bitter. It doesn't necessarily mean that.
No, there's a lot more to hops than the bitterness, for sure.
Yeah, no, and to me it's very similar to sour beers. I think people are getting away from that. How sour can you make a beer, and looking at more aromatic complexity and balance and all those sorts of things. And to me, that's what I want to drink. I want something that I can have a second one of, and not something that has too much alcohol or too much bitterness or too much sourness that is meant to wow in a 1 ounce pour at a tasting or at a beer fest. The stuff I brew, the stuff I want on tap is the stuff that I want to be able to drink a glass of every couple of days until the keg's gone in a couple of months, Not something that is a special occasion beer or I need to dump this because it's, been sitting too long. I need something else.
Now, how do you handle the dry hopping? What's your technique there?
So it depends on the hops. I tend to like whole hops for dry hopping. You need to bag them. I use knee-highs, fresh knee-highs from the grocery store. And I load up a bunch of marbles in the bottom. I tie off the marbles so that when I'm done dry hopping, I can snip off the marbles and save them and not have to pick them out of the hop material that's in the rest of it. The goal is not to pack them in there too tightly, so I generally do 2 dry hop additions. In this case, it was a dry hop on about day 3 or 4. Waited it, let it sit in there for about a week until it was ready to kegged it, and then when I'm ready to keg, I put another dose of dry hops. Again, in this case, in both of those, they were 1 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe. Waited again, put it in the keg, flush the keg with CO2, rack the beer in, close it up, chill it down, put it on forced carb. Hopefully a week later, it's about ready to drink.
So the hops just stay in there in the bag
indefinitely, yeah. And I tend not to get green grassy flavors. I like to believe that part of that is the whole hops. With pellet hops, you have so much more surface area. The cell walls are broken up. Just more chance you're going to be extracting the stuff inside the hops. And so for whole hops, yeah, I've never had an issue with them. And honestly, I love hoppy beers. I drink them pretty quick. And so it's not like it's going to be sitting in there for 6 months. There's not much you can do for a beer at that point. If it lasts 2 months, that's about all I need for a good IPA.
Yeah, I did something similar with the first low gravity rye wit, quote unquote, beer that I did. It didn't have, I did some hop bursting at the end of the boil. It didn't have the hop character that I wanted, and so I did a hop bag in the keg, and it was in there for a long time, and I didn't get any undesirable characteristics from the hops. So I don't think that people need to necessarily fear from doing that for an extended period of time.
And if you're the sort of person who either very worried about this or feels that you might psychosomatically convince yourself you can tie off the hop bag so that it won't fall down with the beer. And so after you say maybe drink a gallon or 2 of the beer, the hops would then be suspended up. You can do either some people run a fishing line or a piece of dental floss out the top, or I've put a worm clamp on the top of some of my dip tubes, and you can then tie off to that inside. So either of those work well. Again, maybe if you're using pellet hops or you're very sensitive to that grassy flavor that you can sometimes get from dry hop beers, whether or not the extended dry hopping is to blame.
And if you do use dental floss, use unwaxed
Unwaxed,
and no mint.
Unless it's a stout.
I get a mintiness from this.
Use a Northern Brewer.
Is this a peppermint beer?
So I'm wondering if the knee highs, do you get a better flavor profile with the sandal toe, or do you, or the taupe, or does the taupe work well?
Or do you use the nude?
I use a neutral color. Just I figure it would have less dye.
Oh, well, they'll let you be nude.
You can certainly use regular hop bags if you want. I just find those have such a fine mesh to them that they are better at, particularly if you don't want bits of hops getting into your beer. That those are the most effective, and then I can just toss them. I don't have to worry about rinsing it out and cleaning it and getting all the gunk out of there. And
Do you have to worry about sanitizing them before you?
I do. I tend to soak them in All-Star Sand. Although honestly, it's going right into a keg. I've never had an issue. Same thing with hops. That there's always some small risk, but it's not a big one.
Well, those are two delicious beers. Now we've got another experiment that we want to do, and I think we've talked long enough about those two beers that I think we should have a part 2 of this conversation. To be continued. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, James.
Thanks again to Mike for the hospitality. We recorded another show on a honey beer experiment that he did. That was a lot of fun. You'll hear that in the coming weeks. Be sure to check out Mike's blog at madfermentationist.com and pick up a copy of American Sour Beers if you haven't already. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. You get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener with any DVD combo. You can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can find our logbooks where you can track and log up to 50 batches of beer. Check all of those out at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click. I'm getting choked up. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We greatly appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Lock and Lube Grease Gun Coupler and The Summer of Beer and Whiskey, How Brewers, Barkeeps, Rowdies, Immigrants, and a Wild Pennant Fight Made Baseball America's Game. Thanks again, everybody, and remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. And don't forget, you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.